prequels that missed the mark, a way too cerebral monster movie, and a universally despised flick that its star called AI generated. Marvel may be the studio behind many blockbuster superhero movies, but it's also churned out some real duds. Even if you've never seen it, odds are you're aware of how utterly awful Howard the Duck truly is. The film was an ambitious attempt at adapting an obscure Marvel Comics character into live action, and it did have a lot going for it. With everything from the work of industrial light and magic to an excellent cast, the film should have worked. The main problem with Howard the Duck that's difficult to overcome is that it tries too hard to be a comedy.
No more Mr. Nice Duck.
On top of that, it includes several aspects of the characters that aren't pleasant to watch, specifically the taboo romance and obvious attraction between Howard and Beverly, played by Leah Thompson. Add to that the overt silliness of the plot, which was overshadowed by the impressive special effects. Unfortunately, the result was a $37 million film that only raked in $37.9 million at the global box office. Daredevil wasn't the greatest adaptation of the character, but the film made money, so the studio went forward with Elektra 2 years later. Jennifer Garner's portrayal of the character in Daredevil suggested she'd be able to carry her own film, but it didn't happen. While Garner's work in Elektra is good, she was hampered by a terrible script. The best actors in the world cannot overcome crummy dialogue, terrible plot lines, and cheesy characters, which is what you have in Elektra. The film was panned by critics and audiences alike, so the $57 million box office take was barely enough to scratch the surface of its $43 million budget. The MCU's Phase 4 failed to build on the hype generated by Avengers Endgame, but to be fair, that's a tough hill to climb. Regardless, Marvel Studios tried several series on Disney Plus and a number of movies, which didn't work as well as the studio would have liked. Ant-Man and the Wasp: Quantumania is one such film, and while it made a decent amount of cash, it wasn't enough. Marvel spent a ton of money bringing Quantumania to theaters. The film's production budget, which was initially set at $200 million, exploded to a staggering $326 million, nearly as much as Endgame. While the film made $476 million, that wasn't enough for the studio to break even. Part of the reason Quantumania failed was because it attempted to emulate the humorous aspects of director Taika Waititi's take on the Thor franchise.
No, I don't have a phone, but you could have sent an electronic letter. It's called an email.
Yeah, do you have a computer?
No, what for?
On top of that, Quantumania crammed way too much into its confusing plot. Its major villain was played by an actor with some very real legal problems, and it was heavily criticized for its VFX, despite the cost. Sony's ownership of the film rights to Spider-Man and his associated characters has made adapting the comics somewhat hit or miss. Marvel Studios forged an agreement to bring Spidey to the MCU, but many of its allies and enemies remain in Sony's Spider-Verse. One such character, Michael Morbius, found his way to live action in 2022. Morbius features Jared Leto in the title role, but the results weren't great. The film script wasn't up to par with comparable MCU films. It included poorly choreographed fights, problematic pacing, and a heavy reliance on CGI particle effects, which make those fight sequences nearly impossible to follow. Morbius made $167 million on a $75 million budget. A subsequent re-release flopped again, with $300,000 in ticket sales before Sony once again pulled the plug. As of 2024, Marvel Studios has yet to release a Fantastic Four film, despite 4 having been made previously. The first was never released, and the next 2 didn't entirely disappoint. The second, Rise of the Silver Surfer, didn't make enough money to garner a third film, so the franchise sat until 2015, when Fox dusted it off for yet another reboot. The Fantastic Four comics have always been somewhat lighthearted and humorous, but the gritty remake in 2015 dumped all of that and went in an entirely different direction. As a result, the long-beloved characters didn't match up to what fans expected from a Fantastic Four adaptation, and the result was a movie that was universally panned. The film cost $120 million, and it made $167 million at the box office, making Fantastic Four a certified box office bomb. One major problem surrounded the film's director, Josh Trank, who spoke out negatively about his own movie hours before it premiered. Trank blamed studio interference for the film's problems. 2004's The Punisher was released to theaters in the spring of that year, starring Thomas Jane as a vigilante superhero, Frank Castle. Unfortunately, while The Punisher had a lot going for it, including a stellar cast, it did not do well at the box office. The budget was relatively small at $33 million, but it only made $54 million in ticket sales. This, coupled with DVD sales, was enough to garner a sequel turned reboot, but as far as its theatrical performance, The Punisher was lackluster at best. Part of the problem is how grim the film comes off. There's not even much satisfaction in seeing the bad guy, played by John Travolta, pay for killing Castle's family. Travolta is also a bit over the top and more comical than threatening.
And Mike, if you don't like it, just remember one thing. I've got more guns than you do.
This doesn't balance well when contrasted against Jane's evocative depiction of the character. Critics weren't impressed either, making The Punisher a box office bomb. 2008's Punisher Warzone was a reimagining that nobody asked for, seeing as the prior Punisher wasn't especially well received. Regardless, the studio behind the property, Lionsgate, made the movie, doing it with a comparable budget. Instead of throwing the needed funding into the project, the budget was capped at $35 million. That limited special effects and makeup, which became problematic. Warzone features all the graphic violence you'd expect in an R-rated Punisher film, but it doesn't come off as gory or gritty. Instead, the violence is over the top, but in a bad way. It's campy and limited, making Warzone unbelievable. And while Ray Stevenson's portrayal of Marvel's gun-toting vigilante was exceptional, he couldn't save the film, which only brought in $10 million at the box office. Dark Phoenix was the 10th X-Men movie and the 4th of the prequel series of films produced by Fox, but it's also the most despised. The movie wasn't cheap, costing the studio $200 million, but it only brought in $252 million in global ticket sales. The biggest problem fans had with the movie was how different it was from the comics. Important character elements were disregarded, making for an unsatisfying adaptation. There are several reasons why Dark Phoenix bombed at the box office, including the fact that the franchise already did a version of this story in X-Men The Last Stand, which was also a disappointing adaptation. On top of that, it didn't utilize its best actors, preferring to focus on other characters. Furthermore, critics and fans didn't hold back in trashing it, killing what little positive word of mouth it may have generated. 20th Century Fox spent a lot of time and money developing the New Mutants, which spent years in development hell. Production had a few starts and stops throughout the process, and thanks to the COVID-19 pandemic and other issues, it had a rocky release. The film was initially slated to premiere in 2018, but delays pushed it to 2020. By the time it finally made its way to theaters, Disney had finalized its acquisition of Fox. This changed the business plan for the X-Men franchise, which included the New Mutants. This was the final film in Fox's pre-Disney X-Men franchise, but instead of promoting it and trying to get people to watch, the film was given a limited August 2020 release, before being dumped on Disney+. This move, as well as a lack of widespread promotion, effectively dooms the New Mutants from the start. The film cost Fox $67 million to produce, but it only pulled in $49 million in ticket sales. Disney doesn't release streaming figures for its movies, so how it did on Disney+ is anyone's guess. Either way, many critics also felt that the film wasn't deserving of 94 minutes of your time.
Hey, Yogi! Lions and tigers and bears, oh my. Red Lockheed.
Eternals hit theaters in late 2021, which wasn't a spectacular time to release a film. The movie features a large cast of characters and plenty of CGI, and it was incredibly expensive. Before tax subsidies that cost $36 million, the studio dropped $272 million on production. The expenses weren't overcome by the film's $402 million box office take, resulting in a $52 million loss. COVID still kept a lot of people away from theaters, and audiences didn't connect with the characters. The film was largely forgettable. Even with the pandemic behind it, Eternals remains a black sheep of the MCU's Phase 4. Few recent films have been as universally despised as Madam Web, and there are numerous reasons why the movie bombed. The film adapts characters from Spider-Man comics, but isn't connected outright to Peter Parker or anything else Spidey-related. This isn't a great way to connect with fans either, but more than that, the characters in the film are nothing like the comic book creations that inspired them. This alienates an existing fanbase, but there's more to it than that. Most people don't know who Madam Web is in the comics unless they're avid readers, so this was a film nobody really asked for. It was eviscerated by critics, garnering an 11% rating on Rotten Tomatoes. The script is terrible and filled with awful dialogue nobody would say unless they were paid to, like the actors in the film.
Did I die?
On top of everyone else disliking Madam Web, its star Dakota Johnson described the plot as AI-generated. She claimed that she never watched the movie, and the film's promotional tour was unenthusiastic.
You don't have to know anything about anything at all to watch this movie.
Madam Web cost Sony somewhere in the low $100 million range, and it only brought in $100 million. Captain Marvel was a fun departure from standard MCU films, taking place in the past and looping Samuel L. Jackson's Nick Fury into the story. The film's plot demanded a sequel, but it didn't arrive for years. You could watch the Marvels without knowing who the adult Monica Rambeau or Kamala Khan are, but you'd be pretty lost. The film's exposition almost demands that you already know those shows before watching the movie, which alienated some viewers. The Marvels is a fun yet unimportant superhero movie starring 3 protagonists only a handful of viewers know well enough to follow. Brie Larson's Captain Marvel was fully established, but the other 2 weren't. A near total lack of promotion due to the SAG-AFTRA strike, scenes set on a planet where everyone sings, a B-grade villain, and superhero fatigue also didn't help this box office bomb. Years before the MCU dominated popular culture, director Ang Lee made Hulk, the first big-screen adventure for Marvel's popular green-skinned rage monster. This was a big deal at the time, and a lot of effort went into honoring the comics through brilliant cinematography that utilized panels and other comic book tropes to visually drive the film's narrative. While the VFX doesn't compare to what exists decades later, it wasn't bad for 2003, and fans finally got to see the Hulk in live action on the big screen. Unfortunately, the film features several significant departures from the source material, which fans never appreciate. On top of that, the film is very cerebral, which put off some viewers, and its glacial pacing didn't help either. Hulk was an ambitious project, and it shows, but it's since been overshadowed by more comic-accurate fare in the MCU. Lee took the character a bit too seriously to depict him properly, making the film a largely forgettable mess. Hulk cost Universal $137 million to produce. The film made $245 million, but not enough for the studio to break even.